Have you ever wondered how America became the great country that it is today, or maybe why our flag has 13 stripes? Today we'll be telling you some of the many reasons why colonists wanted their independence from Great Britain. The protests in Boston, taxation without representation in the colonies, and the contradiction of the reasons the colonies were established in the beginning all led to the Revolutionary War. I'm here to inform the students of America on the tragic events of our ancestors' past, so history never repeats itself. My information was found at history.com. First, I would like to talk about the main reasons the colonies were established. In 1607, Jamestown, Virginia was the first British colony planted in present-day America. Jamestown was mainly founded for the purpose of making money. It was a port and a trading center. Jamestown was seen as a place for people to come and make their fortunes. But once the Boston Port Act was passed as part of the Intolerable Acts, the reasons the colonies were established became pointless. The Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston until the colonies paid for the damages in the Boston Tea Party, which will be talked about later. The second reason the colonies were established was freedom of religion from the Protestant Anglican churches in Great Britain. Settlers wanted the right to their own beliefs and traditions, but with all the new taxes being put into place, colonists felt threatened by Britain. Secondly, many colonists were getting fed up with the unfair treatment they were receiving from Great Britain. Britain was placing many unreasonable taxes on the colonists. You may have heard of some of the taxes like the Sugar Act, the Tea Act, or maybe even the Quartering Act. The two taxes passed that made a big statement were the Stamp Act and the Intolerable Acts. The Stamp Act was passed in 1765, and it was a tax on the legal recognition of documents. This act required colonists to pay a tax on every piece of paper they use. The papers included everything from ship papers, legal documents, licenses, newspaper, and other publications to even playing cards and envelopes. Colonists were very upset about the Stamp Act being passed, and they definitely weren't too happy about this next one. The Townshend Act imposed taxes on British china, glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea imported into the colonies. In the 18th century, tea was all the rage in Great Britain, so this new tax really put an impact on the colonists. Charles Townshend, implementer of the act, chose those particular items because he knew that it would be so much harder for the colonists to try and produce them themselves. But, however, the colonists decided that they were going to start doing it instead of paying taxes on imported goods. The biggest act passed by British Parliament was the Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts were passed as a punishment after the defiance of the Tea Party protests. 4 acts were passed within the series of the Intolerable Acts. First one was the Boston Port Act, which was mentioned earlier, and it closed the port of Boston until the colonies repaid the damages they caused during the Tea Party. The next act was the Massachusetts Government Act that took away Massachusetts' charter and brought it under control of the British government. Third, the Administration of Justice Act allowed the royal governor to order trials accused on royal officials to take place in Great Britain instead of the colonies. And lastly, the Quartering Act applied to all of the colonies, and it created a more effective way of housing British troops. In the previous Quartering Act, the colonists had been required to help provide housing for soldiers, but they were being very uncooperative. In the new Quartering Act, it allowed the governor to house these soldiers in other buildings if quarters were not provided for the soldiers. Now turning to the protest in Boston, Massachusetts. On March 5th, 1770, a street fight broke out in Boston between a patriot mob and a squad of British soldiers. After a British soldier was being assaulted and attacked by colonists, he called in for reinforcements. Violence quickly escalated and one soldier fired his weapon, and following him the rest of the British soldiers opened fire too. In the end, 5 colonists were injured and 6 were wounded. This fueled many anti-British views in the colony. About 3 years later, on December 16, 1773, another protest broke out in Boston. The Boston Tea Party was a political protest by the Sons of Liberty. American colonists were frustrated and angry at Britain for all of the taxation without representation in the colonies and dumped 342 chests of tea into the Boston Harbor. This event was the first major act of defiance in the colonies against the British rule. It demonstrated to Great Britain that Americans wouldn't stand for unfair taxation, and the protests rallied American patriots across the 13 colonies to fight for independence. To conclude, taxation without representation, the reason for the colonies in the first place, losing their value, and the protests in Boston all led to the colonists wanting their independence from Britain. Stand with me, and let's never forget the hardships that Britain placed on our ancestors and making sure history does not repeat itself.